Hello there, fellow seekers of hidden truths and untold stories. How has your day been treating you? What time is it where you are in the world right now? Whether you're listening from bustling Tokyo at dawn, quiet countryside England in the afternoon, or perhaps somewhere in the American heartland as evening settles in, I want you to know that you're part of something special here. Before we dive into tonight's tale, I'd like to ask you to subscribe to Sleep Theories if you haven't already. Your support helps us continue uncovering the stories that others would prefer remain buried in the shadows of history. Tonight's story takes us back to one of the most controversial chapters in American history, to a time when the impossible became possible, when cinema and reality blurred beyond recognition, and when one man's artistic genius may have been used to deceive the entire world. This is the story of Kubrick's Moon. The fluorescent lights of the American Film Archive hummed their familiar tune as Julian Maris hunched over the Steenbeck editing table, his 29-year-old frame casting long shadows across the cluttered workspace. The basement restoration room smelled of chemical preservatives and old celluloid, a scent that had become as familiar to him as his own reflection. As a British-American film restorationist with an obsession for Cold War cinema, Julian had spent the better part of 5 years in this underground labyrinth of forgotten footage and discarded dreams. The estate collection had arrived 3 weeks ago in unmarked aluminum cans, each one bearing only a series of numbers that meant nothing to anyone, except perhaps the dead man who had owned them. The deceased, according to the paperwork, had been Harold Pembroke, a former NASA media contractor who had worked on various documentation projects during the Apollo program. His widow, apparently eager to clear out decades of accumulated film stock, had donated everything to the archive without bothering to inventory the contents. Julian had been systematically working through the collection, expecting the usual assortment of industrial films, training footage, and bureaucratic documentation that typically emerged from government contractors. Most of it was exactly that. Endless reels of engineers explaining rocket trajectories, astronauts practicing procedures, and officials giving carefully worded statements to the press. But this particular reel, labelled simply H1107, was different. The 70mm film stock was pristine, professionally processed, and bore none of the usual degradation Julian had come to expect from footage of this vintage. As he threaded it through the Steenbeck, he noticed something else unusual. The sprocket holes were perfectly aligned, suggesting this had been shot on professional Hollywood equipment rather than the standard 16mm stock NASA typically used for their documentation. The first few frames showed the familiar lunar surface, grey and desolate under harsh lighting. Julian had seen countless hours of Apollo footage, and this appeared to be from the historic Apollo 11 mission. Neil Armstrong's bulky white spacesuit dominated the frame as he took those first tentative steps onto the lunar surface, his movements deliberate and careful in the low-gravity environment. But then Julian saw something that made his blood run cold. There, clear as day, in the upper right corner of the frame was a clapperboard. Not a reflection, not a shadow, but an actual wooden clapperboard with chalk writing that read, "Moon, take 7 Tranquility Base." Julian's hands trembled as he advanced the film frame by frame. The clapperboard disappeared after a few seconds, clearly edited out in post-production, but its presence was undeniable. He rewound the section and watched it again, his heart pounding with each revelation. The voice that came through the audio track was unmistakably that of Stanley Kubrick. Julian had studied the director's work extensively, had memorised the cadence and accent from countless interviews and behind-the-scenes footage. The voice was giving direction. "Neil, tilt your head left slightly. Don't step too far forward. The dust kicks wrong when you move too quickly." Julian felt the room spinning around him. This couldn't be real. This had to be some kind of elaborate hoax, a fan film or student project that had somehow found its way into Pembroke's collection. But the film stock was authentic, the processing was professional, and the voice was undeniably Kubrick's. He continued watching, transfixed by what he was seeing. There were multiple takes of Armstrong's famous first steps, each one slightly different, each one accompanied by Kubrick's patient direction. In one take, Armstrong stumbled slightly, breaking character to curse under his breath. In another, the director called for the dust to be reset between takes. The most damning evidence came 20 minutes into the footage. As Armstrong moved away from the camera, Julian could clearly see a boom microphone hanging into the upper portion of the frame, its fuzzy windscreen clearly visible against the stark black of the lunar sky. The boom was quickly pulled up and out of frame, but for those few seconds it was there. Undeniable proof that this was not the vacuum of space, but a carefully constructed soundstage. Julian sat back in his chair, his mind racing. If this footage was authentic, it meant that one of the most celebrated achievements in human history was nothing more than an elaborate piece of cinema. The implications were staggering, not just for American history, but for the entire narrative of human progress that had been built around the Apollo program. He rewound the footage and watched it again, looking for any signs of forgery or manipulation. But the more he studied it, the more convinced he became that what he was seeing was real. The lighting was too perfect, the camera movements too fluid, the direction too professional to be anything other than a major Hollywood production. The timestamp on the footage read July 16th, 1969, 3 days before the official Apollo 11 landing. Julian's hands shook as he reached for his notebook and began documenting everything he was seeing. Frame numbers, time codes, dialogue. He meticulously recorded every detail, knowing that he was potentially holding the most explosive piece of evidence in modern history. As he worked, Julian became aware of a strange sensation, as if he were being watched. The basement restoration room was supposed to be secure, accessible only to authorized personnel, but the feeling persisted. He glanced around the room, noting the security cameras in the corners that he had never paid attention to before. Were they recording him? Did someone already know what he had discovered? The paranoia felt ridiculous, but Julian couldn't shake the feeling that his life had just changed forever. He carefully removed the reel from the Steenbeck and placed it in a secure storage container, then made multiple digital copies on separate drives. If this footage was what he thought it was, he would need to be very careful about how he proceeded. The rest of the evening passed in a haze of excitement and terror. Julian found himself jumping at every sound, scrutinizing every shadow, wondering if he was being followed as he made his way home to his small apartment in Georgetown. The weight of what he had discovered felt almost physical, a burden that pressed down on his shoulders with each step. That night Julian barely slept. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, his mind churning with questions and possibilities. How had this footage survived for 50 years? Why had it been included in Pembroke's collection? Was there more evidence out there, hidden in other archives or private collections? But the biggest question of all was what he should do with this information. Going public would be career suicide. Who would believe him? The moon landing conspiracy theories had been thoroughly debunked by scientists, engineers, and independent researchers. Anyone who claimed to have evidence of a hoax was immediately dismissed as a crank or attention seeker. Yet Julian knew what he had seen. The footage was real, the voice was Kubrick's, and the implications were earth-shattering. As he finally drifted off to sleep in the early hours of the morning, one thought kept echoing in his mind. If Stanley Kubrick had filmed the moon landing, then the greatest achievement in human history was nothing more than the greatest lie ever told. 3 days of sleepless nights and obsessive research had left Julian looking haggard and paranoid. He had spent every available moment studying the footage, analysing every frame, cross-referencing the audio with known recordings of Kubrick's voice. The evidence was overwhelming, but he needed more than just a single reel of film. He needed context, corroboration, and most importantly, he needed to find someone who had been there. His research had led him to Livia Reeve, a sharp-tongued media historian who had worked briefly as an assistant to various directors during the late 1960s. According to his sources, she had been employed by Kubrick during the production of 2001, A Space Odyssey, and had remained in his circle for several years afterward. Now, in her 70s, she lived in a cluttered apartment on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, surrounded by decades of accumulated film memorabilia and industry gossip. Julian had called ahead, claiming to be researching a documentary about Kubrick's influence on science fiction cinema. It was a weak cover story, but it had gotten him through the door. Livia Reeve was a small woman with steel grey hair, and eyes that seemed to see through every pretense. She had agreed to meet with him, but Julian could sense her wariness from the moment he stepped into her apartment. The living room was a shrine to the golden age of Hollywood, with framed photographs of famous directors, vintage movie posters, and shelves lined with film canisters and industry publications. Livia gestured for him to sit in a worn leather chair while she prepared tea, her movements precise and economical despite her age. "So you're writing about Stanley's influence on science fiction," she said, settling into her own chair with a cup of Earl Grey. "That's been done to death, you know. What angle are you taking that hasn't been covered by every film school graduate in the past 30 years? Julian had rehearsed this moment, but now that he was face to face with someone who had actually known Kubrick, his carefully prepared words felt inadequate. "I'm particularly interested in the period right after 2001, he said carefully. "The late 60s, early 70s. There seems to be a gap in the historical record. Projects that were started but never completed." Livia's expression didn't change, but Julian noticed her fingers tighten slightly around her teacup. "Stanley was always starting projects and abandoning them," she said. "He was a perfectionist, you know. Nothing was ever good enough for him." "I've heard rumours about some government work," Julian pressed, watching her reaction carefully. "Documentation projects, training films, that sort of thing. Would you know anything about that?" "The government?" Livia laughed, but there was no humour in it. "Young man, Stanley Kubrick wouldn't have made a government training film if they had offered him $1 million. He despised authority, despised being told what to do. He certainly wouldn't have worked for the military or NASA or any of those bureaucratic organisations." But Julian had caught something in her tone, a slight hesitation that suggested she was hiding something. He decided to take a more direct approach. "I found some footage," he said quietly. "Unmarked, unprocessed. It shows what appears to be outtakes from the Apollo 11 mission, but with Kubrick's voice giving direction." The effect was immediate and dramatic. Livia's face went white, and her teacup rattled against its saucer as she set it down with shaking hands. For a long moment, she stared at Julian without speaking, her eyes wide with what appeared to be genuine fear. "You need to leave," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Right now. Take whatever you found and burn it. Forget you ever saw it." "I can't do that," Julian said, leaning forward in his chair. "If this is real, if what I think happened actually happened, then people have a right to know. The whole world has been living a lie for 50 years. Livia stood abruptly, pacing to the window that overlooked the busy street below. She stood there for several minutes, her silhouette framed against the afternoon light, before turning back to face him. "You have no idea what you're dealing with," she said. "No idea at all. The people who arranged that project, they don't just go away. They don't retire. They don't forget." "What project?" Julian asked, his heart racing. "What are you talking about?" Livia seemed to be weighing her options, studying his face as if trying to determine whether he could be trusted. Finally, she walked to an old wooden desk in the corner of the room and retrieved a small key from a hidden compartment. She unlocked a drawer and pulled out a manila envelope, yellowed with age. "I should have destroyed this years ago," she said, holding the envelope as if it contained something poisonous. "But I couldn't. I kept thinking that someday, someone would need to know the truth." She handed him the envelope and Julian opened it with trembling fingers. Inside were several documents, typed memos, handwritten notes, and what appeared to be contracts with various government agencies. The letterhead on one of the documents read Project Horizon Echo, with a Pentagon address. "They approached him in 1968, Livia said, sitting back down heavily, right after 2001 was released. They said they had a special project, something that would be the ultimate test of his technical abilities. They offered him complete creative control over his next 3 films, unlimited budgets, and protection from any future legal troubles." Julian scanned the documents, his excitement growing with each revelation. "And he agreed?" At first he said no. Stanley was suspicious of everyone, especially government types, but they were persistent. They kept coming back, offering more money, more creative freedom, and then... Livia paused, as if the next part was particularly difficult to say. They told him what would happen if he didn't cooperate. They threatened him? They didn't have to threaten directly. They just made it clear that his career, his reputation, his safety, all of it could disappear overnight. They showed him photographs of other directors who had refused to work with them, people who had suffered mysterious accidents or career-ending scandals. Julian felt a chill run down his spine. So he agreed to fake the moon landing? Not fake, Livia corrected. That was the genius of it. They told him he was creating a backup plan, insurance in case the real mission failed. They said the footage would only be used if something went wrong, if the astronauts died, or the mission was compromised. Stanley convinced himself he was serving his country, protecting America's reputation in the Cold War. But they used the footage anyway. Of course they did. The real mission was never going to succeed. They knew that from the beginning. The technology wasn't ready. The risks were too great. But they couldn't admit that to the world, couldn't let the Soviets win the space race. So they used Stanley's footage and buried the truth so deep that even most of the people involved never knew what really happened. Julian studied the documents more carefully, noting names, dates, and technical specifications. One memo described the construction of a massive soundstage in the Nevada desert, disguised as a nuclear testing facility. Another detailed the recruitment of actors and technical personnel, all of whom were required to sign extensive non-disclosure agreements. "Where did you get these?" he asked. I was Stanley's assistant during the production. I handled his correspondence, managed his schedule, typed his notes. I saw everything. Livia's voice was flat, emotionless. I thought I was working on the most important film project in history. I had no idea I was helping to perpetrate the biggest lie ever told. Julian found a document near the bottom of the stack that made his blood run cold. It was a list of names with dates next to them, and several of the names had been crossed out in red ink. Next to each crossed-out name was a brief notation. Auto accident, 1971. Heart attack, 1973. Suicide, 1975. "These people," Julian said, pointing to the crossed-out names, "they're dead?" Livia nodded grimly. Everyone who worked on the project was monitored for the rest of their lives. Anyone who showed signs of wanting to talk, anyone who seemed like they might become a problem. They had accidents. Natural causes, they called them. But there were too many coincidences, too many convenient deaths. "Then why are you still alive?" "Because I kept my mouth shut. Because I never tried to go public, never tried to profit from what I knew. And because I was careful to stay useful to them." She gestured around the apartment. "They've been watching me for 50 years. They know I have this material, but they also know I'm not a threat as long as I keep quiet." Julian felt the weight of the documents in his hands, understanding now that he was holding not just evidence of a massive conspiracy, but potentially his own death warrant. "There's something else," he said. "In the footage I found, there's a code mentioned. Something about G3 and Stage 17 and Tranquility." Livia's eyes widened. "You found the G3 reference?" "What is it?" "Geraldine 3. It was the code name for the most sensitive part of the operation. The part that even Stanley wasn't supposed to know about." She stood and walked to another desk, retrieving a small black address book. "This belonged to Stanley. He gave it to me for safekeeping before he died. Made me promise to keep it hidden." Julian opened the book and found it filled with coded entries, numbers, letters and symbols that meant nothing to him. But on the last page, written in what appeared to be Kubrick's handwriting, was the phrase, "G3/Stage 17/Tranquility. The truth is in the basement." "What does it mean?" Julian asked. "I don't know," Livia admitted. But Stanley was terrified of it. He said it was the one thing that could destroy everything, the one piece of evidence that would bring down the entire operation. He said if anyone ever found G3, it would mean the end of the world as we know it. Julian stared at the cryptic notation, his mind racing. "I need to find this G3. I need to know what Stanley was so afraid of." "No," Livia said firmly. "You need to walk away. You need to forget everything you've seen and heard today. Because if you keep digging, if you keep asking questions, you're going to end up like all the others whose names are crossed out in red ink." But Julian was already committed. The story was too big, the implications too massive to ignore. He stood to leave, carefully placing the documents back in their envelope. "Thank you for telling me the truth," he said. "I didn't tell you anything," Livia replied. "As far as anyone knows, you came here to ask about Stanley's influence on science fiction cinema, and I told you I couldn't help you. That's the only story that will keep us both alive." As Julian left the apartment, he could feel Livia's eyes on his back, watching him walk away. He had the strange sensation that he was being followed, that eyes were tracking his every movement from windows and doorways. The paranoia was getting stronger, but he couldn't tell if it was justified or if the stress of his discovery was making him imagine threats that didn't exist. One thing was certain: his life had become infinitely more complicated and dangerous. But he was committed now, driven by a need to uncover the truth that had been hidden for more than half a century. The next step was to decode Stanley Kubrick's cryptic message and find the mysterious G3 that had terrified the great director so much that he had taken its secret to his grave. The basement of the Library of Congress was a maze of climate-controlled storage rooms and forgotten archives, the kind of place where history went to die quietly. Julian had spent 3 days trying to decode Kubrick's cryptic message, cross-referencing every possible meaning of G3/Stage 17/Tranquility, with known film production codes, government classifications, and Cold War terminology. The breakthrough had come when he realised that the numbers might not be a code at all, but an actual address, a reference to a specific storage location within the vast network of government archives. Using his credentials as a film researcher, Julian had gained access to the classified media collections that most scholars never knew existed. The basement levels of the Library of Congress contained thousands of hours of footage from government agencies, military operations, and intelligence organisations. Material that had been deemed too sensitive for public consumption, but too historically significant to destroy. Storage Unit G3 was located in the deepest sub-basement, accessible only through a series of security checkpoints and locked doors. Julian had spent the better part of the morning convincing the archival staff that he needed access to research Cold War propaganda films, a vague enough description that it didn't raise immediate suspicions. The unit itself was smaller than he had expected, containing only a few dozen film canisters and a single cardboard box marked Personal Effects SK 1999. Julian's heart raced as he opened the box, knowing that SK could only refer to Stanley Kubrick, who had died in March of that year. Inside the box were several items that appeared to be personal mementos: a pair of eyeglasses, a leather notebook, and most importantly, a small reel of magnetic tape, labelled Private Recording Not for Archive. Julian stared at the tape, understanding instinctively that this was the G3 that Livia had mentioned, the secret that had terrified Kubrick so much that he had hidden it away in the depths of the government's most secure facility. Finding a tape player in the archive's equipment room, Julian threaded the reel and pressed play. The voice that emerged from the speakers was unmistakably Kubrick's, but older and more tired than in the footage Julian had discovered. The timestamp on the recording indicated it had been made in late 1971, just after the release of A Clockwork Orange. "I don't know why I'm making this recording," Kubrick's voice began, the words heavy with exhaustion and regret. "Perhaps because I need to tell someone, even if that someone is only myself. Perhaps because I hope that someday, when I'm gone, someone will find this and understand what really happened." Julian leaned closer to the speaker, hanging on every word. "I did it for peace," Kubrick continued, "for America and for cinema. But I never expected to become part of the greatest lie ever told. They came to me in 1968, these men in grey suits with their classified documents and their promises of artistic freedom. They told me they needed my help, that the future of the country depended on my cooperation." The recording paused, and Julian could hear the sound of ice clinking in a glass, the strike of a match, the deep inhalation of a cigarette. The Saturn V rocket was a magnificent piece of engineering, but it was also a death trap. The heat shield problems, the guidance system failures, the countless technical difficulties that NASA was hiding from the public, they all added up to one inescapable conclusion. The moon landing was impossible with the technology available in 1969, but they couldn't admit that. They couldn't let the Soviets win the space race, so they came to me. Julian felt his worldview shifting with each revelation. Everything he had believed about human achievement, about the triumph of technology and determination, was crumbling before his eyes. The soundstage was built in the Nevada desert, disguised as a nuclear testing facility. Stage 17 of the Lookout Mountain Laboratory, they called it. The security was incredible. Armed guards, electronic surveillance, psychological evaluations for everyone involved. They told us we were creating backup footage, insurance in case the real mission failed. But I knew better. I knew they never intended to risk actual astronauts' lives. Kubrick's voice grew quieter, more reflective. The technical challenges were extraordinary. We had to create a lunar environment that would fool not just the general public, but also scientists and engineers who understood the physics of space travel. The lighting had to be perfect. The gravity simulation had to be flawless. Every detail had to be absolutely convincing. It was the greatest technical achievement of my career, and it was all in service of a lie. Julian found himself taking notes frantically, trying to capture every detail of Kubrick's confession. Neil Armstrong was the perfect choice for the hoax. He was a genuine hero, a test pilot with nerves of steel and an absolute commitment to the mission. But he was also a man who could keep a secret. They told him he was participating in a training exercise, that the footage would only be used if something went wrong with the real mission. I don't think he ever knew the truth. But then Kubrick said something that made Julian's blood run cold. Buzz Aldrin was different. He was suspicious from the beginning, asked too many questions, demanded to know why certain procedures were being followed. They couldn't risk him becoming a problem, so they made a decision. Buzz Aldrin never set foot on the soundstage. Everything you see of him in the footage is either a double in the spacesuit or composited footage from earlier training sessions. Julian paused the recording, his mind reeling. If Kubrick was telling the truth, then not only was the moon landing faked, but one of the most famous astronauts in history had been completely written out of the actual production. The lunar module was a masterpiece of set design, Kubrick continued when Julian restarted the recording. We built it in sections, each one designed to be filmed from specific angles. The interior shots were done on a separate soundstage, with careful attention to continuity and lighting. The exterior shots required the most sophisticated matte painting techniques available at the time. Kubrick paused again, and Julian could hear the sound of pages turning, as if the director was consulting notes. The most difficult part was the regolith, the lunar dust. We had to create a substance that would behave like moon dust in low gravity, but we were working in Earth's gravity. The solution was a combination of fine sand, talcum powder, and a proprietary mixture that the special effects team developed. It looked perfect on camera, but it was hell to work with. Everyone involved in the production had respiratory problems for months afterward. Julian made a note to research respiratory illnesses among NASA personnel in the early 1970s, wondering if there might be medical records that could corroborate Kubrick's story. The flag controversy was entirely accidental, Kubrick said, and Julian could hear a note of dark humour in his voice. The flag was supposed to hang limp, the way it would in the vacuum of space, but the air conditioning system in the studio created a slight breeze, and the flag began to flutter. By the time we noticed, we had already shot several takes. The decision was made to leave it in, to make the footage look more dynamic and heroic. We never imagined it would become one of the most analysed pieces of film in history. Julian thought about all the conspiracy theorists who had pointed to the fluttering flag as evidence of a hoax, never realising how close they had come to the truth. Michael Collins was the only astronaut who knew the complete truth, Kubrick continued. He was the liaison between the production and NASA, the one who made sure our footage matched the official timeline and narrative. He was also the one who made sure that everyone involved understood the consequences of talking. The recording grew quiet again, and when Kubrick spoke, his voice was filled with regret. I thought I was serving my country, contributing to a great patriotic effort. But as the years passed, as I watched the footage being broadcast around the world, as I saw children looking up at the moon and dreaming of space exploration, I realised what I had really done. I had stolen humanity's greatest achievement and turned it into nothing more than a movie. Julian felt a chill as he realised the full implications of what he was hearing. If Kubrick was telling the truth, then the entire space program, the inspiration for generations of scientists and engineers, the foundation of modern space exploration, all of it was built on a lie. There were others who knew the truth, Kubrick said, his voice growing more urgent. Technicians, cameramen, set designers, special effects artists. They started having accidents in the early 1970s. Car crashes, heart attacks, suicides. Anyone who seemed like they might become a problem simply disappeared from the record. Julian thought about the list of names that Livia had shown him, the red ink marking the deaths of those who had been involved in the production. "I've been living with this secret for 25 years, Kubrick concluded. It's poisoned everything I've done since, every film I've made, every relationship I've had. The guilt is unbearable, but the fear is worse. They've made it clear that as long as I keep making films, as long as I remain a valuable asset to them, I'll be protected. But if I ever try to tell the truth, if I ever try to undo what we did, I'll join the others whose names are crossed out in red ink." The recording ended with the sound of Kubrick switching off the machine, leaving Julian alone in the basement archive with the weight of the most explosive secret in modern history. Julian sat in the darkness for several minutes, trying to process what he had heard. If Kubrick's confession was genuine, then everything he thought he knew about the space program was wrong. The moon landing, the foundation of American technological supremacy, the inspiration for decades of scientific advancement, all of it was nothing more than an elaborate piece of cinema. But Julian also understood that he was now in mortal danger. He had found the G3 that had terrified Kubrick, the confession that could bring down the entire carefully constructed mythology of the space program. And if the people who had orchestrated the original hoax were still alive, still monitoring anyone who got too close to the truth, then his life was now in serious jeopardy. As he carefully packed away the recording and prepared to leave the archive, Julian made a decision. He couldn't walk away from this story, couldn't pretend he had never heard Kubrick's confession. The truth was too important, the implications too massive to ignore. But he also couldn't go public with what he knew, not without more evidence, not without protection. He needed to find someone who could help him, someone who understood the machinery of government secrecy and conspiracy. He needed to find Lieutenant Colum Warren de Motte, the retired Air Force liaison who had been mentioned in several of the documents Livia had shown him. De Motte was the only person still alive who had been directly involved in the original operation, the only one who might be able to confirm Kubrick's story and help Julian understand the full scope of what he was dealing with. But first he had to get out of the archive safely. As Julian made his way back through the security checkpoints and up to the main floor of the Library of Congress, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that his every move was being monitored by unseen eyes. The paranoia was no longer just a feeling, it was a rational response to a very real threat. The game of truth and deception that had begun with a single reel of film was about to enter its most dangerous phase, and Julian Maris, a simple film restorationist who had stumbled upon the greatest secret in modern history, was now a player in a deadly game that had been running for more than 50 years. The drive to Montana took Julian 3 days, during which he became increasingly convinced that he was being followed. The same silver sedan had appeared in his rearview mirror outside Washington, D.C., on the interstate through Pennsylvania, and again at a rest stop in Illinois. Each time he tried to get a better look at the driver, the car would disappear, only to reappear hours later in a different configuration, sometimes with different license plates, sometimes with different occupants. By the time he reached the remote valley where Lieutenant Colum Warren de Motte had chosen to spend his retirement, Julian's nerves were frayed to the breaking point. The address he had found in Livia's documents led him to a modest ranch house surrounded by hundreds of acres of grassland, with the Rocky Mountains rising dramatically in the distance. It was the kind of place where a man could disappear completely, where the outside world seemed like a distant and irrelevant concept. De Motte answered the door himself, a tall, lean man in his late 70s with steel-grey hair and the kind of ramrod-straight posture that marked him as career military. His eyes were sharp and suspicious as he looked Julian up and down, taking in every detail of his appearance and demeanour. "You're the film restorer," Demotte said without preamble. "The one who's been asking questions about Stanley Kubrick." Julian felt his stomach drop. "How did you know I was coming?" "Because they told me you were coming. They've been watching you since you found that first reel of footage. They know every move you've made, every person you've talked to, every document you've read." Demotte stepped aside to let Julian enter the house. "The question is whether you're here as their agent or as someone genuinely seeking the truth." The interior of the house was sparse but comfortable, with the kind of functional furniture that suggested a man who had spent his life in military barracks and government offices. The walls were decorated with framed photographs of aircraft and military units, but Julian noticed that there were no pictures of space missions or NASA facilities. "I'm not working for anyone," Julian said, settling into a leather chair across from Demotte. "I'm just a film restorer who stumbled onto something that's bigger than I can handle." Demotte studied him for a long moment, then walked to a window that looked out over the valley. "You found Geraldine 3. That was the file that was never supposed to leave the vault. They let it sit in that basement for 20 years, thinking nobody would ever get that far. You know about the recording?" "I know about everything, son. I was the Air Force liaison to the project. I was the one who recruited the technical personnel, who managed the security clearances, who made sure that everyone involved understood the consequences of talking." Demotte turned back to face Julian, his expression grim. "I was also the one who compiled the list of problems that needed to be eliminated." Julian felt a chill run down his spine. "You mean the people who died?" "I mean the people who were killed," Demotte corrected. "Let's not pretend it was anything other than what it was. When you're dealing with a secret that could bring down the government, that could destroy America's credibility in the eyes of the world, you don't take chances. You eliminate threats. And you're telling me this because..." Demotte was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the mountains. "Because I'm dying," he said finally. "Lung cancer, courtesy of 20 years of smoking government cigarettes and breathing whatever chemicals they used to create that fake moon dust. The doctors give me maybe 3 months." Julian didn't know what to say. The man sitting across from him was confessing to multiple murders, with the casual tone of someone discussing the weather. "I've spent 50 years keeping this secret," Demotte continued. 50 years watching good people die because they asked the wrong questions or remembered the wrong details. And for what? To protect a lie that's gotten so big, so embedded in American mythology, that the truth would probably destroy more lives than the original deception ever saved. Demotte walked to an old wooden desk and pulled out a thick manila folder. "This contains everything," he said, setting it on the coffee table between them. "Personnel files, technical specifications, security reports, elimination orders, the complete record of Project Horizon Echo." Julian stared at the folder as if it were a venomous snake. "Why are you giving this to me?" "Because I'm tired of carrying the weight of it alone. Because I want someone to know the truth before I die. And because..." Demotte paused, looking directly into Julian's eyes. "Because they're planning to activate the contingency protocol." "What contingency protocol?" "The one that eliminates everyone who was ever connected to the project. Everyone who might potentially become a security risk. They've been planning it for years, waiting for the right moment when all the loose ends could be tied up simultaneously." Julian felt the blood drain from his face. "You mean they're going to kill everyone?" "Everyone who's still alive, yes. Livia Reeve, the 3 remaining technicians who worked on the soundstage, the 2 actors who served as body doubles, and now you." Demotte's voice was matter-of-fact, as if he were discussing a routine military operation. "The official story will be a series of unfortunate accidents. Car crashes, heart attacks, home invasions. Nothing that would attract attention individually, but collectively it will clean the slate permanently." Julian stood abruptly, panic rising in his chest. "I have to warn them. I have to..." "Sit down," Demotte said firmly. "Running around trying to warn people will only accelerate their timeline. Besides, most of them already know. They've been living with this threat for 50 years. Julian forced himself to sit back down, his mind racing. "Then what do I do? How do I stop this?" "You don't stop it. You expose it. You make the truth so public, so widespread, that killing you becomes counterproductive. You force them to acknowledge what happened rather than continue trying to hide it. But how? Who would believe me? Even with all this evidence, people will just dismiss it as another conspiracy theory. Demotte smiled grimly. That's the beauty of it. They've spent so much time discrediting moon landing conspiracy theories that they've created the perfect cover for their own deception. No one takes the theories seriously anymore because most of them are obviously false. But your evidence is different. Your evidence is real. Julian opened the folder and began scanning the documents inside. Personnel files with photographs, technical specifications for the soundstage construction, budget allocations for special effects materials, and most damning of all, a series of memos discussing narrative management and public perception control. One document caught his attention, a psychological profile of Stanley Kubrick dated 6 months before he was approached for the project. The profile described him as highly susceptible to patriotic appeals, unlikely to cooperate if presented with the proper incentives and assurances. They studied him, Julian said, looking up at Demotte. They knew exactly how to manipulate him. They studied everyone. That's how intelligence operations work. You identify your targets, understand their motivations and weaknesses, then craft an approach that makes cooperation seem like the only rational choice. Julian continued reading, finding more disturbing details with each page. The project had involved dozens of people, cameramen, sound technicians, set designers, security personnel, all of whom had been carefully selected based on psychological profiles and security assessments. The budget had been enormous, funded through a complex web of black operations accounts and military contractors. The moon rocks, Julian said, coming across as a particularly interesting document. How did they handle the moon rocks that the astronauts supposedly brought back? Real moon rocks, Demotte replied, collected by unmanned Soviet probes and purchased through back-channel diplomatic negotiations. The Soviets knew what we were doing, of course. They had their own fake space achievements to protect. Julian felt his worldview shifting again. The Soviets were in on it? Not officially, but their intelligence services understood what was happening. They had their own problems with their space program, technical failures, cost overruns, safety issues. Both sides had an interest in maintaining the fiction that space exploration was progressing smoothly. It was a mutually beneficial deception. As Julian continued reading, he began to understand the full scope of the operation. It wasn't just about faking the moon landing. It was about creating and maintaining a complete alternate reality, a version of history that served the interests of both superpowers while hiding the true limitations of their technology. What about the subsequent missions? Julian asked. Apollo 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17 inches. Some were real, some weren't. Apollo 13 was genuine, an actual near disaster that they used to demonstrate the competence of NASA's mission control. The others were a mixture of real orbital flights and soundstage footage, depending on what the technical situation allowed and what the political situation required. Julian found a document that made his hands shake, a list of potential security risks that included not just the people who had worked on the project, but also their family members, friends, and associates. Dozens of names with detailed surveillance reports and threat assessments. My God, Julian whispered, they've been watching everyone for 50 years. Not just watching, managing, controlling, steering their careers, their relationships, their entire lives to ensure that no one ever gets close enough to the truth to cause problems. Demotte walked to another window, this one facing west toward the setting sun. I've been part of this machinery for half a century, and I'm tired of it. Tired of the lies, tired of the killing, tired of living in fear that someday someone will discover what we did and the whole house of cards will come tumbling down. So what happens now? Julian asked. Now you take that folder and you disappear. You go somewhere they can't find you easily, and you figure out how to make this information public in a way that can't be suppressed or discredited. You have maybe 72 hours before they realise I've given you everything and decide to accelerate their timeline. Julian stood, clutching the folder to his chest. What about you? I'll be fine. They won't move against me until they're sure all the other loose ends are tied up, and by then, it won't matter. Demotte's smile was sad but determined. I'm dying anyway. At least this way, my death will serve a purpose. As Julian prepared to leave, Demotte grabbed his arm. Remember, this isn't just about the moon landing. This is about the nature of truth itself, about who gets to decide what history looks like and what the public is allowed to know. Once you open this door, you can never close it again. Julian nodded, understanding the weight of what he was taking on. As he walked back to his car, the folder hidden in his jacket, he felt the eyes of history watching him. He was no longer just a film restorer who had stumbled onto an interesting piece of footage. He was now the keeper of the most dangerous secret in modern history, and the decisions he made in the next few days would determine whether that secret remained buried forever or finally saw the light of day. The drive back to civilization seemed longer than the journey out, every mile taking him further from the safety of Demotte's remote valley, and closer to the web of surveillance and control that had been woven around this secret for more than half a century. But Julian was committed now, driven by a sense of purpose that transcended his own safety or comfort. The truth was finally within reach, and no force on earth was going to prevent him from sharing it with the world. The cybercafe in downtown Denver was the kind of place that catered to people who needed to stay anonymous. Gamers using fake identities, journalists protecting sources, activists evading government surveillance. Julian had chosen it carefully, paying cash for 3 hours of computer time and selecting a terminal in the back corner, where he could monitor both entrances while he worked. The folder Demotte had given him contained enough evidence to rewrite history, but Julian knew that simply releasing the documents wouldn't be enough. The information had to be presented in a way that would capture public attention and resist immediate debunking. More importantly, it had to be distributed through channels that couldn't be easily shut down or suppressed. He had spent the previous night in a cheap motel outside the city, digitizing every document in the folder with a portable scanner he had purchased with cash. The resulting files filled several thumb drives, each one containing enough evidence to destroy the carefully constructed mythology of the space program. Julian's plan was elegant in its simplicity. Rather than trying to release everything at once through traditional media channels, which could be pressured, bought, or threatened into silence, he would use the decentralized nature of the internet to ensure the information couldn't be suppressed. Multiple uploads to different platforms, simultaneous releases across various forums and networks, a coordinated information dump that would be impossible to contain. He started with the most dramatic piece of evidence, a compressed video file containing the key segments of the footage he had discovered, along with audio from Kubrick's confession. The file was small enough to upload quickly, but compelling enough to grab immediate attention. He posted it to 3 different video sharing platforms simultaneously, using different accounts and different titles to avoid automated detection systems. Next came the documents themselves. Julian uploaded them to several file sharing sites, encrypted archives on peer-to-peer networks, and even old-fashioned bulletin board systems that were still maintained by privacy advocates and conspiracy researchers. Each upload was accompanied by a detailed explanation of how the evidence had been discovered and what it meant for our understanding of history. The most important upload was to Celluloid Truth, a darknet archive that specialized in leaked film footage and suppressed media. The site had built a reputation for hosting materials that mainstream platforms wouldn't touch, protected by layers of encryption and distributed servers that made it nearly impossible to shut down. Julian's upload included everything: the original footage, Kubrick's confession, Demotte's documents, and a comprehensive analysis tying it all together. As he worked, Julian became aware that his time was running out. The cafe was filling up with the evening crowd, and he had noticed the same man in a brown jacket nursing a coffee near the front entrance for the past hour. Every few minutes the man would glance in Julian's direction, then return to reading his newspaper. Julian forced himself to remain calm and continue working. He uploaded the files to social media platforms, embedding them in posts that would be automatically shared across multiple networks. He sent copies to dozens of journalists, researchers and activists, people who had built careers on exposing government deception and corporate cover-ups. The key was to make the information so widespread, so public, that suppressing it would require shutting down half the internet. By the time the authorities realized what was happening, millions of people would have already seen the evidence. Julian's final upload was to his own social media accounts. A simple post that read, "The truth about Apollo 11 is finally here. Everything we've been told is a lie. Kubrick's moon, space hoax, truth at last," with links to all the uploaded files. As soon as he hit the post button, Julian's computer screen flickered and went black. The man in the brown jacket was walking toward him, and Julian could see 2 more men entering through the back exit. They had found him. Julian grabbed his backpack and the remaining thumb drives, then bolted for the emergency exit. An alarm sounded as he pushed through the door, but he was already running down the alley behind the building. Behind him, he could hear shouting and the sound of pursuit. The next few hours passed in a blur of paranoia and adrenaline. Julian ditched his car and took a bus to the airport, then bought a ticket to the first flight leaving the city, a red-eye to Seattle that would get him as far away from Denver as possible. As the plane took off, he watched the city lights disappear below and wondered if he would ever feel safe again. But even as he fled, Julian could see that his plan was working. His phone, carefully set to monitor the uploads, showed that the files were spreading rapidly across the internet. The celluloid truth upload had been viewed 100,000 times in the first hour. Social media was exploding with shares, comments, and analysis. The story was going viral faster than any suppression effort could contain it. Major news outlets were already picking up the story, though most were treating it with skepticism. "New moon landing hoax claims surface online," read one headline. "Internet conspiracy theory links Stanley Kubrick to faked Apollo footage," read another. But buried in the dismissive coverage was acknowledgement that the evidence was unusually sophisticated and difficult to immediately debunk. Julian smiled grimly as he read the early responses. The mainstream media's initial skepticism was exactly what he had expected, but it wouldn't last. The evidence was too compelling, too detailed, too well documented to be dismissed as another internet conspiracy theory. Experts would examine the footage, authenticate the documents, verify the audio recordings. The truth would emerge, slowly but inevitably. But even as he celebrated this initial success, Julian knew that the real battle was just beginning. The people who had orchestrated the original deception wouldn't give up easily. They would launch a counter-offensive, discrediting the evidence, attacking his credibility, spreading disinformation to muddy the waters. More dangerously, they would continue their efforts to eliminate anyone who posed a threat to their secret. Julian's public exposure had bought him some protection. Killing him now would only validate his claims, but it wouldn't stop them from going after the others. Livia Reeve, the surviving technicians, anyone else who could provide corroboration for his story. As the plane descended towards Seattle, Julian made a decision. He couldn't just release the evidence and hope for the best. He had to stay engaged, continue fighting, help the truth emerge despite all the efforts to suppress it. He had started something that couldn't be stopped, but it would need constant attention and protection to reach its full potential. The game was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. The safe house in the hills above Seattle was provided by a network of investigative journalists and whistleblower advocates who specialized in protecting people who had exposed government secrets. Julian had been there for 3 days, watching the internet explode with debate about his revelations, while trying to stay ahead of the forces that were undoubtedly hunting for him. The initial response had been everything he had hoped for and feared. The evidence was spreading faster than any containment effort could stop it, but the counterattack was already beginning. Within 24 hours of his upload, several fact-checking websites had published detailed debunkings of his claims, complete with expert testimony and technical analysis that seemed designed to confuse rather than clarify. The debunking efforts followed a predictable pattern. First, they acknowledged that the footage appeared authentic, but suggested it was part of an elaborate art project or film school experiment. Then they produced experts who claimed the audio analysis was flawed, that the voice wasn't really Kubrick's, that the documents were sophisticated forgeries. Most damaging was a story that appeared in a major technology publication, claiming that Julian himself was a fabrication, that Julian Maris was actually the pseudonym of a known conspiracy theorist with a history of creating fake evidence for internet hoaxes. The story included a detailed biography of this fictional person, complete with photographs and social media profiles that had obviously been hastily created. Julian watched the disinformation campaign unfold with a mixture of admiration and horror. The speed and sophistication of the response demonstrated that he was dealing with an organisation that had decades of experience in managing information and controlling narratives. They weren't just denying his claims, they were systematically undermining his credibility and creating alternative explanations for every piece of evidence he had presented. But the most chilling development came on his 4th day in the safe house. A news report from New York announced that Livia Reeve had died in her apartment, apparently the victim of a home invasion robbery. The report mentioned that nothing appeared to have been stolen, but that the elderly woman had suffered a fatal heart attack during the break-in. Julian stared at the television screen, knowing with absolute certainty that Livia's death was not a random crime. She had been eliminated because his revelations had made her too dangerous to leave alive. The guilt was overwhelming. He had gotten an innocent woman killed by dragging her into his investigation. The news report was followed by an interview with a supposed expert on conspiracy theories, who used Livia's death to reinforce the debunking narrative. This tragic incident shows how dangerous these internet hoaxes can be, the expert said. When false claims go viral, they can put innocent people at risk from unstable individuals who believe the misinformation. Julian turned off the television and began pacing the small living room of the safe house. The counterattack was more sophisticated than he had anticipated. They weren't just denying the evidence, they were using the very consequences of their own actions to discredit his claims. Livia's murder had been turned into a weapon against the truth she had died trying to protect. His phone rang, startling him out of his thoughts. The number was blocked, but Julian answered anyway, knowing that his location was already compromised. "Mr. Maris?" The voice was calm, professional, with just a hint of an accent that Julian couldn't place. "My name is David Sinclair. I represent certain interests that would like to speak with you." "Let me guess," Julian said. "You want to offer me money to recant my story. Or maybe you want to threaten me into silence. Neither, actually. We want to offer you the truth." Julian paused, caught off guard by the unexpected response. "What do you mean?" "The story you've uncovered is more complex than you realise. Yes, Stanley Kubrick was involved in creating footage related to the Apollo program, but the footage wasn't used to fake the moon landing. It was used to hide something much more important. Something that, if revealed, would fundamentally change humanity's understanding of its place in the universe." "You're saying the moon landing really happened?" "I'm saying that what happened on the moon was so extraordinary, so far beyond what the public was prepared to accept, that a cover story had to be created. Kubrick's footage wasn't used to fake the landing. It was used to hide what the astronauts actually found up there." Julian felt his worldview shifting again. And what did they find? Evidence that humanity is not alone in the universe. Structures on the lunar surface that were clearly not created by natural processes. Technology that was far beyond anything we had developed. Proof that someone else had been there first. The caller let this sink in for a moment before continuing. The decision was made at the highest levels of government that the public couldn't handle the truth. The psychological, social and religious implications would have been catastrophic. So they created a simpler narrative. Brave astronauts taking humanity's first steps into space, while hiding the reality that we had discovered we were not the first. Julian sank into a chair, trying to process what he was hearing. "You're saying the whole conspiracy theory is backwards?" "I'm saying that the truth is more complex than either the official story or the conspiracy theories suggest. Yes, there was deception. Yes, footage was faked. But not to hide failure, to hide a success that was too dangerous to reveal." "Why are you telling me this?" "Because your investigation has created a crisis. The evidence you've released is accurate as far as it goes, but it's incomplete. It's leading people toward a truth that they're not prepared to handle. We need your help to manage the situation, to guide the revelation in a way that won't cause mass panic or social collapse." Julian laughed bitterly. "You want me to help you cover up the cover-up?" "We want you to help us reveal the truth gradually, responsibly, to prepare humanity for a reality that will fundamentally change everything we thought we knew about ourselves and our place in the cosmos. The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, with Sinclair outlining a plan for managed disclosure that would slowly prepare the public for the revelation of extraterrestrial contact. Julian listened with growing skepticism, recognising the sophisticated manipulation tactics that were being employed. When the call ended, Julian was more convinced than ever that he was dealing with an organisation that would say anything, promise anything, create any narrative necessary to protect their secrets. The story about alien artifacts on the moon was probably just another layer of deception, designed to confuse and misdirect anyone who got too close to the truth. But the call had confirmed one thing: his revelations were having an impact. The fact that they were willing to contact him directly, to offer him alternative explanations and opportunities for cooperation, meant that they were worried. The truth was getting out despite their best efforts to contain it. Julian made a decision. He wouldn't be intimidated, bribed, or deceived into abandoning his investigation. He would continue pushing for the truth, no matter how complex or dangerous it became. The public deserved to know what their government had done, what lies they had been told, what secrets had been kept from them for more than half a century. As he prepared to leave the safe house and continue his investigation, Julian reflected on how much his life had changed since he first discovered that unmarked reel of film. He had started as a simple film restorer and become a fugitive, a truth-teller, a guardian of one of the most explosive secrets in human history. The game was far from over, and Julian was beginning to understand that the real truth might be stranger and more complex than anything he had imagined. But whatever the complete story might be, he was committed to uncovering it and sharing it with the world, no matter what the cost might be to himself or others. The truth he had learned was not just a destination, but a journey, one that might lead to places he had never imagined, and revelations that would change everything he thought he knew about reality itself. 2 weeks later, Julian Maris disappeared. His rental car was found abandoned in a remote area of Olympic National Forest, the keys still in the ignition, his personal belongings scattered across the front seat, as if he had left in a hurry. The official investigation concluded that he had become disoriented while hiking, and had likely fallen into one of the area's many ravines or been attacked by wildlife. No body was ever found. The media coverage of his disappearance was brief and dismissive. Most outlets described him as a conspiracy theorist, who had been troubled by the negative response to his claims about the moon landing. The implication was clear. He had either committed suicide in despair or fled to avoid the consequences of his hoax. Within a month, Julian's apartment in Georgetown was sold to new owners who claimed to have no knowledge of the previous tenant. His employment records at the American Film Archive were quietly purged, leaving no official trace that he had ever worked there. His social media accounts were deleted, his bank accounts closed, his entire digital footprint systematically erased. To the outside world, Julian Maris had simply never existed, but the evidence he had uploaded continued to circulate in the darker corners of the internet, shared among conspiracy researchers and truth seekers who recognized its significance. The footage, the documents, the audio recordings, all of it remained available to anyone willing to look hard enough, serving as a persistent reminder that some secrets were too big to stay buried forever. The official response to Julian's revelations followed the predictable pattern of denial, debunking, and disinformation. Government spokesmen dismissed the evidence as sophisticated but ultimately unconvincing fabrications. NASA held press conferences featuring experts who methodically dismantled each claim with technical arguments that sounded authoritative but were designed more to confuse than to clarify. The mainstream media largely ignored the story after the initial burst of coverage, treating it as just another internet conspiracy theory unworthy of serious attention. When the story was mentioned at all, it was usually in the context of discussions about the dangers of misinformation and the gullibility of people who believed what they read online. But in the months that followed Julian's disappearance, strange things began to happen to others who had been connected to the original project. A retired NASA engineer died in a suspicious car accident after announcing his intention to write a memoir about the Apollo program. A former Air Force photographer was found dead in his home from an apparent drug overdose, despite having no history of substance abuse. A movie industry technician who had worked at Lookout Mountain Laboratory in the late 1960s died suddenly of a heart attack at the age of 58. The pattern was subtle but unmistakable to anyone who knew what to look for. The final phase of the cleanup operation was underway, the elimination of anyone who might be able to corroborate Julian's claims or provide additional evidence of the deception. Lieutenant Column Warren DeMott died peacefully in his Montana ranch house, exactly 3 months after Julian's visit, his lung cancer progressing precisely as the doctors had predicted. His death attracted no attention beyond a brief obituary in the local newspaper. The ranch was sold quickly to an anonymous buyer who immediately demolished the house and converted the property to grazing land. Among DeMott's effects, investigators found a handwritten note that read simply, "The truth is bigger than any of us realized. I'm sorry for my part in keeping it hidden." The note was dismissed by authorities as the confused ramblings of a dying man, possibly influenced by the conspiracy theories that had been circulating online. The truth, it seemed, had died with the last of those who had lived it. But in the final scene of this particular drama, there was one last twist that even the architects of the cover-up hadn't anticipated. A small television station in Nebraska was preparing a retrospective program about the Apollo missions when their archivist discovered something unusual in their old footage collections. Buried among reels of routine news coverage from 1972 was a brief segment that had apparently never been broadcast, containing an interview with an unidentified man who claimed to have worked on a secret government film project. The footage was grainy and the audio was poor, but the man's voice was unmistakably that of Stanley Kubrick. And his words, spoken more than 50 years ago to a reporter who had probably long since forgotten the interview, contained a cryptic message that seemed to speak directly to the present moment. "In the end," Kubrick's voice whispered from the television speakers, barely audible above the static and interference, "the truth is not what you can see, it's what they won't let you question." The station aired the footage as part of their Apollo retrospective, presenting it as a curiosity from their archives, without understanding its significance. But for those few viewers who recognised the voice and understood the implications, it served as a final confirmation of everything Julian Maris had died trying to reveal. The greatest lie in human history had been exposed, but only to those who were willing to see it. The official narrative remained intact, protected by layers of denial, disinformation, and the simple human tendency to believe what was comfortable rather than what was true. And somewhere in the shadows, the machine that had been built to protect this secret continued to operate, watching, waiting, ready to eliminate any new threats that might emerge. Because some truths, the guardians of the secret believed were too dangerous for humanity to handle. The moon continued to shine in the night sky, a silent witness to the greatest deception ever perpetrated. But for those who knew where to look, who understood what questions to ask, its light seemed somehow different. Not the beacon of human achievement it had once appeared to be, but a reminder that even our greatest triumphs might be nothing more than carefully constructed illusions. The truth was out there, hidden in plain sight, waiting for the next Julian Maris to stumble upon it and risk everything to bring it into the light. Because no matter how sophisticated the cover-up, how thorough the elimination of evidence, how complete the control of information, there would always be someone willing to ask the questions that weren't supposed to be asked. And in the end, that might be enough to ensure that even the greatest lies couldn't last forever. The story of Kubrick's moon had ended, but the search for truth continued, carried forward by those who refused to accept that some secrets were too dangerous to reveal. The moon landing conspiracy had been exposed, but the deeper questions it raised about truth, power, and the nature of reality itself remained as relevant as ever. In a world where reality itself had become a contested battlefield, where the line between truth and fiction grew ever more blurred, the story of Julian Maris served as both a warning and an inspiration. A warning about the price of seeking forbidden knowledge, and an inspiration for those who believed that no truth was too dangerous to be told. The credits rolled on this particular story, but the larger narrative of humanity's relationship with truth and power continued to unfold, one frame at a time, in the endless reel of history that would never stop running. If you enjoy tonight's journey, please consider subscribing. We've only just begun to scratch the surface. Tonight's tale takes us beneath one of America's most controversial airports, where infrastructure analyst Lina Morano discovers that some blueprints reveal more than just electrical systems and water pipes. Sometimes they reveal the architecture of conspiracy itself. Lina Morano had always found comfort in the predictable geometry of infrastructure. Power grids, water systems, subway tunnels. They all followed logical patterns that made sense when you understood the underlying principles. People were chaotic and unpredictable, but a well-designed electrical system would behave exactly as the blueprints promised, every single time. That's why she preferred working alone, armed with nothing but her laptop, measuring tools, and an encyclopedic knowledge of municipal engineering standards. At 32, she had built a reputation as one of the most thorough freelance infrastructure analysts in the Southwest. Her clients ranged from small municipalities checking their aging water systems to federal contractors who needed someone discreet and competent to verify that their projects met specifications. The Denver International Airport contract had come through Civic Grid, a federal subcontracting firm she'd worked with twice before. The job seemed straightforward enough. Audit the airport's internal power grid following a series of complaints about energy surges that had been causing problems with the baggage handling systems. The pay was excellent, almost suspiciously so for what appeared to be routine work, but Lina wasn't in a position to question good fortune. She'd been struggling to make ends meet since her father's death 6 months earlier. The cancer had eaten through his savings and hers, leaving her with a pile of medical bills and a grief that felt like a physical weight in her chest. This job would help her get back on her feet, financially and emotionally. Sometimes the best therapy was losing yourself in work that made logical sense. On a cold Monday morning in early March, Lina drove her Honda Civic through the sprawling complex of Denver International Airport, past the iconic white peaks of the terminal roof that resembled a mountain range or a series of circus tents, depending on your perspective. She'd read about the airport's unusual design and the various conspiracy theories that swirled around it, but she'd dismissed most of them as internet nonsense. People loved to see sinister patterns where none existed. The Civic Grid site office was located in a temporary trailer on the airport's eastern edge, near the cargo facilities. Gavin Bales, the project lead, was a thin man in his 50s with prematurely grey hair and the kind of nervous energy that suggested too much coffee and not enough sleep. He wore a rumpled white shirt and a tie that looked like it had been knotted in a hurry. "Morano, right? Good to meet you," he said, shaking her hand with a grip that was slightly too firm. "I've heard excellent things about your work. We need someone who can be thorough but discreet. This audit is strictly internal. No need to involve the airport's regular maintenance staff in our findings." Lina nodded, though something in his tone made her slightly uneasy. What exactly are we looking for? The initial briefing mentioned energy surges, but I'd like to understand the full scope of the problem. Bales pulled out a thick folder of blueprints and spread them across a folding table. The airport's been experiencing irregular power fluctuations, mostly in the lower levels. Nothing dangerous, but it's affecting some sensitive equipment. We need you to trace the electrical systems, identify any potential causes, and recommend solutions. The blueprints showed the airport's 3 official sub-levels, A, B, and C. Level A housed the main baggage handling systems, Level B contained mechanical equipment and storage, and Level C was designated for emergency systems and utility access. The electrical schematics were complex, but not unusually so for a facility of this size. "I'll need access to all 3 levels," Lena said, studying the drawings, "and I'll want to compare these blueprints with the actual installations to make sure everything matches." "Of course. Your security clearance came through this morning." Bales handed her a badge and a set of keycards. "These should get you into any area you need to access. Just remember, we're looking for electrical issues, not conducting a general facility inspection. Some areas of the airport are off limits for security reasons." Lena clipped the badge to her jacket and pocketed the keycards. "Understood. How long do I have to complete the audit?" 2 weeks should be sufficient. We'll need a preliminary report by Friday, and the final assessment by the end of the month." Bales began rolling up the blueprints. "One more thing. You might encounter some outdated maps or conflicting information in the airport's systems. The facility has been expanded and modified several times since it opened. If you find anything that doesn't match these official blueprints, don't worry about it. Some of the older documentation is just legacy data that hasn't been properly updated." There was something in the way he said legacy data that made Lena look up from her notebook. But Bales was already moving toward the door, checking his watch. "I'll let you get started," he said. "Feel free to call if you have any questions, but try to keep interruptions to a minimum. We're all very busy around here." After Bales left, Lena sat alone in the trailer, spreading the blueprints across the table and comparing them to the digital files on her laptop. Everything seemed to match, but she noticed something odd in the CAD drawings. There were electrical conduits and access panels marked for sub-levels D and E, even though these levels weren't shown on any of the architectural plans. She made a note to investigate the discrepancy. In her experience, inconsistencies in infrastructure documentation often revealed important information about how a system actually functioned, as opposed to how it was supposed to function according to the original design. The first few days of work proceeded normally. Lena spent her time in the upper levels of the airport, tracing electrical systems and checking circuit panels. The airport was a busy place, with thousands of passengers moving through the terminals each day, but the sub-level areas were quieter. She encountered maintenance workers occasionally, but most of them seemed too busy with their own tasks to pay much attention to her. On Thursday morning, she decided to investigate the electrical systems on sub-level C. According to the blueprints, this was the deepest level of the airport, containing emergency generators and backup systems. The elevator descended smoothly, and she stepped out into a long corridor lined with utility panels and mechanical equipment. The lighting was dimmer here, and the air had a different quality, cooler and somehow denser. Lena could hear the distant hum of machinery, but the corridor itself was empty. She consulted her blueprints and began systematically checking each electrical panel, comparing the actual installations with the documented specifications. Everything seemed normal until she reached the end of the corridor. According to the blueprints, there should have been a wall here, but instead she found herself facing a heavy steel door marked with a sign that read Gate C Vault, Authorized Personnel Only. Lena checked her blueprints again. There was no mention of any vault or secure area in this location. She tried her keycards, not expecting them to work, but to her surprise, the red light on the card reader turned green, and she heard the heavy click of electronic locks disengaging. The door opened to reveal an elevator shaft that descended into darkness. The elevator car was much larger than the standard passenger elevators in the airport, with walls that looked like they were designed to transport heavy equipment rather than people. There was no floor indicator, just a simple up and down button. Lena stood in the doorway, weighing her options. Bales had specifically told her to focus on electrical issues and not to conduct a general facility inspection. But she'd also been hired to identify any problems with the power grid, and if there were electrical systems in this vault area, they would need to be included in her audit. She pressed the down button. The elevator descended for what felt like several minutes, far longer than it should have taken to reach another sub-level. When the doors finally opened, Lena stepped out into a space that was unlike anything she had seen in the airport above. She was standing in a vast underground chamber, easily the size of an aircraft hangar. The ceiling was at least 30 feet high, supported by massive concrete pillars that disappeared into shadows at the edges of her vision. The lighting was provided by industrial fixtures that cast harsh, bright pools of illumination, separated by areas of deep shadow. The walls were covered with murals that were similar to the famous artwork in the airport above, but these were different, unfinished, somehow more raw and disturbing. One wall showed what appeared to be a map of the world, but the coastlines were wrong, as if showing the continents after some catastrophic change in sea level. Another mural depicted a phoenix rising from flames, but the flames seemed to be consuming human figures that were barely visible in the shadows of the paint. Lena walked deeper into the chamber, her footsteps echoing in the vast space. Along the walls she could see the entrances to several corridors and smaller rooms. Most of the doors were labelled with symbols that looked like some kind of script, but not in any language she recognised. The characters were angular and geometric, almost like a stylised version of Arabic or Hebrew, but clearly something else entirely. In the centre of the chamber she discovered something that made her stop and stare. A set of railway tracks that disappeared into a tunnel at the far end of the space. The tracks looked new, as if they'd been recently maintained, but there was no train car in sight. Next to the tracks she found a small maintenance shed that contained what appeared to be a control panel for some kind of automated system. The control panel was covered with switches and gauges, but the labels were in that same strange script she'd seen on the doors. There was also a laminated map that showed what looked like a network of tunnels extending far beyond the airport grounds. The map was marked with symbols and abbreviations that meant nothing to her. HELIX DSMK Continuity 88. As she studied the map, she noticed something glinting on the floor near the control panel. It was a leather journal, bound with a cord and clearly old. The leather was worn and stained, as if it had been dropped and forgotten months or years ago. Lena picked up the journal and opened it to the first page. The handwriting was small and precise, written in blue ink that had faded slightly with age. Property of Dr. Elliot Creel, contract engineer, Denver International Airport Phase 2 construction. If found, please return to Civic Grid Project Office or contact the Federal Emergency Management Agency, Continuity Operations Division. The date on the first entry was June 15th, 1997, almost 30 years ago. Lena turned the page and began to read. Day 1. Arrived at DIA for what was supposed to be a routine inspection of the baggage handling systems. However, I've been reassigned to something called Blue Facility, a designation I can't find in any of the official project documentation. My security clearance has been upgraded, and I've been told that this assignment is classified under the National Security Act. I'm not sure what to make of this, but the pay increase is substantial. Lena continued reading, growing more disturbed with each entry. Day 5. Blue Facility is much larger than I initially understood. The official blueprints show 3 sub-levels, but I've now been given access to areas that extend at least 6 levels below the main terminal. The elevator system is completely separate from the passenger elevators, and some of the corridors extend for miles underground. I've been told this is all part of an enhanced baggage handling system, but I can't understand why such an elaborate network would be necessary. Day 12. I've discovered that the baggage handling equipment includes what appears to be a complete underground transportation system. There are multiple train lines, loading docks, and what look like holding areas that could accommodate thousands of people. When I asked my supervisor about this, he told me that all major airports have emergency evacuation procedures, but this seems far beyond what would be required for a normal emergency. Day 18. Found a room filled with what appear to be detailed maps of North America, showing population centres, transportation networks, and what I can only describe as resource allocation zones. The maps are marked with symbols that correspond to major airports in other cities. I'm beginning to suspect that whatever is being built here is not unique to Denver. Day 23. The murals in the upper terminal are apparently matched by similar artwork down here, but these are different, darker, more explicit about what they're depicting. One shows what appears to be a global catastrophe, with continents partially submerged and major cities destroyed. Another shows groups of people being led into underground facilities. I've been told these are historical murals depicting humanity's triumph over adversity, but they look more like blueprints for something that hasn't happened yet. Lena turned the page, but the next entry was written in a different handwriting, as if Creel had been writing in a hurry or under stress. Day 30. They know I've been asking questions. My access has been restricted, and I've been told that my assignment is ending early, but I've seen enough to understand what this place really is. This isn't an airport. It's a staging ground. The continuity program isn't about maintaining government operations during an emergency. It's about controlling what happens after the emergency. Day 31. I've made copies of some of the documentation and hidden them in a safe deposit box in downtown Denver. The key is taped under the drawer of my desk at home. If something happens to me, maybe someone will find this journal and understand what's really going on here. The final entry was dated July 2nd, 1997. They've scheduled me for a debriefing tomorrow morning. I don't think I'm going to make it home tonight. If someone finds this journal, please contact my wife, Sarah Creel, in Boulder. Tell her I love her and tell her to stay away from the airports when the storms begin. The first storm wasn't the last. Keep moving. Lena closed the journal, her hands trembling slightly. She looked around the vast chamber with new eyes, seeing not just an unused storage area but something more sinister. The train tracks, the control systems, the strange maps. It all suggested a level of preparation and coordination that went far beyond anything that should exist beneath a civilian airport. She checked her watch and realised she'd been underground for over 2 hours. It was time to get back to the surface and think about what she'd discovered. But as she walked back toward the elevator, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. The elevator doors were closed and there was no call button on this side. Lena tried not to panic as she searched for another way out of the underground chamber. The elevator shaft was the only exit she could see, but there had to be emergency procedures for situations like this. She examined the elevator doors more closely and found a small emergency panel that could be opened with a coin or screwdriver. Using her house key, she managed to pry open the panel and found a manual override switch. After flipping it, she was relieved to hear the elevator machinery activate. The doors opened, and she quickly stepped inside, pressing the up button repeatedly until she felt the car begin to rise. When she emerged back onto sub-level C, she was surprised to find that the heavy steel door to the vault area was now closed and locked. Her keycard no longer worked on the reader, which now showed a steady red light. It was as if the system had reset itself while she was underground. Lena made her way back to the surface, her mind racing with questions. She needed to research Dr. Elliot Creel and find out what had happened to him. She also needed to understand what Continuity 88 referred to, and whether the underground facility she'd discovered was still active. That evening, in her apartment in downtown Denver, she began her investigation. A simple internet search for Dr. Elliot Creel returned dozens of results, but most of them were confusing or contradictory. According to some sources, he had been a civil engineer who had worked on several major infrastructure projects in the 1990s. Other sources suggested he had been involved in classified government work related to emergency preparedness. The most disturbing information came from a newspaper article dated July 15th, 1997, with the headline, "Local Engineer Missing After Airport Accident." The article was brief. Dr. Elliot Creel, 45, a consulting engineer working on Denver International Airport expansion projects, was reported missing after failing to return home from work on July 2nd. Airport officials say Dr. Creel was last seen entering a restricted area of the facility during a routine inspection. Search teams have been unable to locate him, and the investigation is ongoing. Dr. Creel is survived by his wife, Sarah, and 2 children. A follow-up article from several weeks later reported that the search had been called off, and that Dr. Creel was presumed dead in what officials described as an industrial accident in a restricted area of the airport. No body was ever found. Lena searched for more information about Sarah Creel and found an obituary from 2019. Sarah had died at age 78, and the obituary mentioned that she was predeceased by her husband, Dr. Elliot Creel, who had died in an accident in 1997. There was no mention of the circumstances of his death or any surviving family members. Her next step was to research Continuity 88 in similar terms. This proved more difficult as most of the search results led to conspiracy theory websites or forums filled with speculation and wild theories. However, she did find some legitimate information about government continuity programs. According to several academic sources, the federal government had maintained various continuity of government programs since the Cold War, designed to ensure that essential government functions could continue in the event of a national emergency or catastrophic attack. These programs involved secure facilities, communication systems, and procedures for evacuating key personnel to safe locations. What was more disturbing was information about how these programs had evolved since the 1990s. Several researchers and journalists had documented evidence that the continuity programs had expanded far beyond their original scope, and that significant resources had been devoted to facilities and systems that seemed designed for scenarios much more severe than traditional nuclear attack or natural disaster. One article, published in a Journal of Emergency Management, mentioned that several major airports had been selected as continuity sites due to their existing infrastructure and strategic locations. The article didn't mention Denver International Airport specifically, but it did note that these sites were often expanded with enhanced underground facilities that could serve multiple purposes. Lena spent the next several days trying to balance her official audit work with her unofficial investigation. During the day, she continued her electrical system inspections, documenting everything according to the scope of her contract. But she also paid careful attention to any details that might relate to the underground facility she'd discovered. She noticed that several of the electrical panels on sub-level C had circuits that weren't accounted for in the official blueprints. When she traced these circuits, they led to areas that were listed as maintenance storage, but which appeared to draw significantly more power than would be needed for simple storage areas. She also discovered that the airport's emergency generator systems were much more extensive than what was shown in the official documentation. There were backup power systems that could apparently support the entire facility for weeks, not just the hours that would be expected for a normal emergency. On Friday afternoon, she submitted her preliminary report to Gavin Bales, focusing on the electrical inconsistencies she had found in the official areas of the airport. She mentioned the discrepancies between the blueprints and the actual installations, but she didn't mention the vault area or Dr. Creel's journal. Bales seemed satisfied with her preliminary findings and told her to focus on completing the electrical audit for the final report. He didn't ask any questions about the inconsistencies she'd noted, which struck her as odd for a project manager who should have been concerned about potential safety issues. That weekend, Lena decided to do more research on the history of Denver International Airport itself. She'd heard various conspiracy theories about the airport over the years, but she'd never taken them seriously. Now, however, she wanted to understand if there was any factual basis for the rumours and speculation. What she found was both fascinating and disturbing. The airport had indeed been the subject of numerous conspiracy theories since it opened in 1995. Some of these theories focused on the airport's unusual artwork, which included murals depicting scenes of war, peace, and environmental destruction. Other theories concerned the airport's layout, including runways that some people claimed were arranged in the shape of a swastika. More interesting were the theories about the airport's construction. Several sources noted that the airport had been built at a cost significantly higher than originally projected, with extensive underground construction that seemed disproportionate to the facility's stated purpose. There had been numerous reports of construction workers finding underground areas that weren't in the official plans, and several contractors had reportedly been dismissed from the project for asking too many questions. One particularly intriguing detail was the airport's Masonic time capsule, which was installed in 1994 and scheduled to be opened in 2094. The plaque marking the time capsule included Masonic symbols and referenced the New World Airport Commission, an organisation that apparently existed only for the purpose of the airport's construction. Lena found herself wondering if Dr. Creel's journal entries about resource allocation zones and staging grounds might be connected to these legitimate questions about the airport's construction and purpose. Was it possible that the conspiracy theories, despite their often outlandish claims, were based on something real? By Sunday evening, she had made a decision. She was going to return to the vault area and conduct a more thorough investigation. She would bring a camera to document what she found, and she would try to access some of the locked rooms that she'd seen during her first visit. But first she wanted to find out more about the key that Dr. Creel had mentioned in his journal. If he had indeed hidden documentation in a safe deposit box in downtown Denver, and if the key was still taped under the drawer of his desk at home, it might provide crucial evidence about what was really happening beneath the airport. Finding Dr. Creel's former address took some research, but she eventually located it through public records. The house was in a middle-class neighborhood in Boulder, about 30 miles from Denver. According to the property records, it had been sold in 1998, the year after Dr. Creel's disappearance. On Monday morning, instead of going to the airport, Lena drove to Boulder. The house in Boulder was a modest 2-story colonial with a small front yard and a detached garage. It looked like it had been well maintained by its current owners, with fresh paint and a neat garden. Lena parked across the street and considered her options. She couldn't simply knock on the door and ask the current owners if she could search for evidence related to a missing person from 30 years ago. But she also couldn't break into the house or trespass on private property. She needed a different approach. After some thought, she decided to pose as a researcher working on a book about Denver International Airport. It wasn't entirely false. She was researching the airport, even if not for a book. She walked up to the front door and rang the doorbell. The door was answered by a woman in her 60s with greying hair and a friendly smile. "Can I help you?" "Hi, I'm sorry to bother you. My name is Lena Morano, and I'm a researcher working on a book about Denver International Airport. I believe a man named Dr. Elliot Creel used to live here in the 1990s, and I was hoping to learn more about him. He was involved in some of the airport's construction projects." The woman's expression changed slightly. "Oh, yes, Doctor. Creel. We bought the house from his widow in 1998. Such a sad story. He disappeared, you know. They never found out what happened to him." "Did you know him personally?" "No, we never met him. But Sarah, his wife, was a lovely woman. She told us a little about what happened when we bought the house. She said he'd been working on some kind of government project, and that he'd been very stressed about it before he disappeared." Lena felt a surge of hope. Did she leave anything behind? Any papers or files that might help me understand what kind of work he was doing? The woman thought for a moment. "Well, there was his home office. Sarah cleared out most of his personal things, but she left some of the furniture. We've been using it as a guest room. There's an old desk that we never bothered to replace. It's a beautiful piece, solid wood. Would it be possible for me to take a look at it? I'm particularly interested in understanding the kind of work he was doing." "I suppose that would be all right. I'm Carol, by the way. Carol Henderson. My husband Tom is at work, but I don't think he'd mind. Come on in." Carol led Lena through a nicely furnished living room, and up a flight of stairs to a small bedroom that had been converted into a guest room. In one corner was a large wooden desk with multiple drawers, exactly the kind of furniture that might have belonged to a professional engineer. Sarah said he spent a lot of time at this desk, Carol said. Sometimes she'd find him working here late into the night, especially toward the end. She thought the stress of his work might have contributed to whatever happened to him. Lena examined the desk carefully. It was indeed a beautiful piece, made of what looked like cherry wood with brass hardware. The drawers were empty, but she noticed that the bottom drawer seemed slightly shallower than the others. "Carol, would you mind if I looked under the drawers? I'm trying to understand how people stored important documents in the 1990s, before everything was computerized." "Of course, go ahead. Though I should mention that Sarah was very thorough when she cleaned out his things. I doubt there's anything left." Lena carefully pulled out the bottom drawer and set it on the floor. The inside of the desk was dark, but she could see that there was a gap between the bottom of the drawer space and the floor of the desk. She ran her fingers along the wood and felt something small and metallic taped to the underside of the drawer frame. It was a key. "Did you find something?" Carol asked, leaning over to look. "Just a key that was taped under here. Probably nothing important, but it might help me understand what kind of security he was dealing with in his work." Lena slipped the key into her pocket and replaced the drawer. She chatted with Carol for a few more minutes, thanking her for her time and promising to mention the house's history in her book if she decided to publish it. Back in her car, Lena examined the key more closely. It was small and brass, with a number stamped on one side, 247. It looked like the kind of key used for safe deposit boxes at banks. Her next challenge was figuring out which bank Dr. Creel had used. She drove back to Denver and spent the rest of the day visiting banks in the downtown area, particularly those that had been operating in the 1990s. At each bank, she explained that she was researching a family member who had disappeared in 1997 and that she had found a key that might belong to a safe deposit box. Most of the banks couldn't help her without proper documentation and proof of relationship to the deceased, but at the fourth bank she visited, First National Bank of Denver, she got lucky. The manager, an older man named Mr. Peterson, remembered Dr. Creel. "Oh yes, I remember him. He came in regularly for about 6 months in 1997, always seemed very nervous. He rented box 247 in April of that year. When we didn't hear from him for several years, we finally opened it according to state law. There wasn't much inside, just some papers and what looked like architectural drawings." "What happened to the contents?" "Well, we tried to contact his wife, but she said she didn't know anything about a safe deposit box. She didn't want the contents, so we kept them in our unclaimed property files. We're supposed to turn them over to the state after 10 years, but to be honest, we've never gotten around to it. There's a whole file cabinet full of unclaimed items going back decades." Lena felt her heart racing. "Would it be possible for me to see what was in the box? I'm researching the airport project he was working on, and it might be relevant to my work." Mr. Peterson considered this. "Well, the property is technically abandoned and you did have the key. I suppose it wouldn't hurt to let you look at the papers, but I can't let you take anything without proper legal documentation." He led her to a storage room behind the main bank and pulled out a file cabinet. Box 247's contents were in a manila envelope marked with Dr. Creel's name and the date the box had been opened. Inside the envelope were copies of blueprints, photographs, and several typewritten documents. The blueprints showed the same underground facility that Lena had discovered, but in much more detail. They included areas that she hadn't seen, including what appeared to be a large assembly hall, dormitory-style sleeping quarters, and rooms marked as medical facilities and communication centres. The photographs were even more disturbing. They showed the underground facility during what appeared to be its construction phase, with workers installing equipment and infrastructure. But they also showed rooms filled with what looked like military equipment, including vehicles and supplies that had no apparent connection to airport operations. The typewritten documents were copies of memoranda and reports, all marked with various classification levels. One document was headed Continuity of Government Exercise 88, Denver Implementation Phase. It outlined a program designed to maintain essential government functions during extended national emergency scenarios, and referenced population management protocols and resource allocation frameworks. Another document was titled ARC Terminal Network, Phase 1 Implementation. It described a network of 6 facilities, all located beneath major airports, that were designed to serve as continuity sites for government operations. The airports listed were Denver, Atlanta, Chicago, Los Angeles, Dallas, and Miami. The most disturbing document was a report titled Population Density Management During Crisis Scenarios. It described procedures for managing civilian populations during extended emergency periods, and included detailed maps showing population concentration zones and resource distribution points throughout the western United States. As Lena read through the documents, she began to understand the scope of what Dr. Creel had discovered. This wasn't just about maintaining government operations during an emergency. It was about controlling large populations during what appeared to be a planned crisis. "This is quite a collection," Mr. Peterson said, looking over her shoulder. "I always wondered what kind of work he was doing. Looks like it was pretty important." "Yes, it was," Lena said quietly. "Mr. Peterson, I know you can't let me take these documents, but would it be possible for me to make copies?" This could be very important for understanding what happened to Dr. Creel. Mr. Peterson thought about this for a moment. Well, I suppose that would be all right. The copy machine is right outside. Lena spent the next hour copying every document and photograph in the file. As she worked, she found herself thinking about Dr. Creel's final journal entry. The first storm wasn't the last. Keep moving. Was he referring to a literal storm or something more metaphorical? And what did he mean by keep moving? By the time she finished copying the documents, it was late afternoon. She thanked Mr. Peterson and returned to her apartment, where she spread all the evidence across her kitchen table. The journal, the blueprints, the photographs, and the classified documents painted a picture of a conspiracy that was far more extensive and disturbing than anything she could have imagined. But she still had one more step to take. She needed to return to the vault beneath the airport and document everything she could find. With the detailed blueprints from Dr. Creel's safe deposit box, she would be able to navigate the underground facility more systematically and gather the evidence she needed to expose what was really happening. She decided to make her final descent the next evening, when the airport would be less busy and she would have more time to explore without interruption. Tuesday evening, Lena arrived at the airport with a backpack containing a high-quality camera, extra batteries, a flashlight, and copies of all the documents she'd discovered. She also brought a small crowbar in case she needed to open any locked doors or access panels. The sub-level areas were even quieter than usual, with most of the maintenance staff having finished their shifts. She made her way to the vault door without encountering anyone, and was relieved to find that her keycard still worked. The door opened with its familiar heavy click, and she stepped into the elevator. This time she was prepared for the long descent. She used the time to review Dr. Creel's blueprints, planning her route through the underground facility. According to the documents, there should be a main control room somewhere near the centre of the complex, and that would be her primary target. When the elevator doors opened, she immediately began taking photographs. The vast chamber looked exactly as she remembered it, but now she understood its purpose. This wasn't just a storage area, it was a staging ground for operations that could potentially affect millions of people. She followed the railway tracks toward the tunnel at the far end of the chamber, documenting everything she saw. The tunnel led to a series of platforms that looked like they were designed for loading and unloading large numbers of people. According to the blueprints, this was connected to a network of tunnels that extended far beyond the airport grounds. In one of the side corridors, she found a room that matched the communication centre, shown in Dr. Creel's blueprints. The room was filled with sophisticated electronic equipment, much of it bearing labels from companies she didn't recognise. There were also several computer terminals, but they appeared to be powered down. The most disturbing discovery was a room marked with symbols that she now recognised as the same script she'd seen throughout the facility. Using her small crowbar, she managed to force open the door and found herself in what appeared to be a medical facility. There were examination tables, medical equipment, and cabinets filled with supplies, but there were also restraints and equipment that looked more suited to a detention facility than a hospital. As she photographed the medical facility, she heard a sound that made her freeze. The distant rumble of machinery starting up. The lights in the facility began to flicker, and she could hear what sounded like ventilation systems activating throughout the complex. She quickly gathered her equipment and headed back toward the main chamber, but as she reached the central area, she saw something that made her blood run cold. The railway tracks were no longer empty. A sleek, modern train car had arrived silently while she was exploring the side rooms. The car was unmarked except for the letters HELIX stencilled on its side. As she watched from the shadows, several people in dark uniforms emerged from the train car. They moved with military precision, setting up equipment and speaking into radio headsets. One of them was a tall man in a tan trench coat who wore what appeared to be a TSA badge. Lena recognised him from a photograph in Dr. Creel's documents, Victor Graal, supposedly dead since 2004. She crept closer, using the concrete pillars for cover, and managed to photograph the activity around the train. The uniformed personnel were unloading crates marked with symbols she recognised from the documents, the same symbols associated with Continuity 88. But as she adjusted her position to get a better angle, her foot knocked against a loose piece of concrete. The sound echoed through the chamber, and several of the uniformed figures immediately turned in her direction. "Sector 7, we have a possible breach," one of them spoke into his radio. "Initiating containment protocols." Lena ran. She sprinted toward the elevator, but as she reached it, she found the doors were closed and unresponsive. The call button didn't work, and the manual override panel had been sealed. Behind her, she could hear footsteps and radio chatter as the search team spread out through the facility. She needed another way out, and according to Dr. Creel's blueprints, there should be emergency exits that connected to the upper levels. She found a service corridor that led away from the main chamber, and followed it deeper into the complex. The corridor was lined with pipes and electrical conduits, and she could hear the pursuit behind her growing more distant. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, she found a service ladder that led upward. The ladder climbed through a narrow shaft for what must have been several stories before reaching a heavy metal hatch. She pushed against it with all her strength, and it finally gave way, allowing her to emerge into a utility room on sub-level A. She was back in the familiar territory of the airport's official infrastructure. She made her way through the maintenance areas and took a passenger elevator to the main terminal, trying to look casual despite her dishevelled appearance and racing heart. As she walked through the terminal toward the exit, she noticed something that made her pause. The airport seemed unusually busy for a Tuesday evening, with long lines of passengers and a sense of urgency that didn't match the normal rhythm of air travel. She approached one of the information monitors and saw that a severe weather warning had been issued for the Denver area. A massive winter storm was approaching, with predictions of heavy snow, high winds, and potential power outages. The airport was recommending that passengers arrive early due to possible flight delays and cancellations. Lena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the approaching storm. Dr. Creel's final journal entry echoed in her mind. The first storm wasn't the last. Keep moving. She hurried to her car and drove home through increasingly heavy snow. The radio was full of weather updates and emergency preparation advisories. The storm was being described as potentially historic, with the possibility of shutting down the entire Denver metropolitan area for several days. Back in her apartment, she uploaded all the photographs she'd taken and began organising the evidence she'd gathered. She needed to get this information to someone who could act on it, but she wasn't sure who she could trust. The conspiracy involved federal agencies and government contractors, which meant that normal law enforcement channels might not be safe. As she worked, the storm outside intensified. The wind howled around her building and the power flickered several times. She could hear emergency sirens in the distance, and the local news was reporting that the airport had been closed indefinitely. Around midnight, her phone rang. The caller ID showed her father's name. Her father had been dead for 6 months. "Hello," she answered, her voice barely a whisper. "Lena." It was her father's voice, exactly as she remembered it. "You found it. That's enough. Go back now." The line went dead. Lena stared at the phone, her hands shaking. She tried to convince herself that it had been a prank call, or some kind of technical glitch, but the voice had been unmistakably her father's. Not just the sound of it, but the way he spoke, the slight accent he'd never quite lost, the particular warmth he'd always used when saying her name. She looked at the evidence spread across her table, the photographs, the documents, the journal. She thought about Dr. Creel, who had tried to expose the truth and had vanished. She thought about the underground facility, the train cars marked with mysterious acronyms, the medical equipment that looked more like instruments of detention than healing. But she also thought about the voice on the phone and the strange certainty in her father's words. That's enough. The storm raged outside and she could hear the city shutting down around her. The power went out shortly after 1 a.m, plunging her apartment into darkness. She gathered the most important documents and put them in a waterproof bag, then lay down on her couch to wait for morning. She woke up 3 days later in her own bed, with no memory of how she'd gotten there. The storm had passed, and bright sunlight was streaming through her windows. Her apartment was clean and organised, with no sign of the documents and photographs that had covered her kitchen table. Her laptop had been wiped clean. Her camera was missing. The copies of Dr. Creel's documents were gone. There was no record of her ever working for Civic Grid. When she called Gavin Bales, the number was disconnected. When she searched online for any mention of her audit contract, she found nothing. It was as if the entire experience had been erased from reality. But on her kitchen counter, she found a single white envelope with her name written on it, in handwriting she didn't recognise. Inside was a brief note. The first storm wasn't the last. Keep moving. E.K. Lena packed a bag that afternoon and left Denver. She drove west without any particular destination in mind, just following Dr. Creel's final advice to keep moving. She didn't know if she was running from something or toward something, but she knew she couldn't stay. As she crossed the Colorado state line, she looked back in her rearview mirror at the mountains surrounding Denver. Somewhere beneath that sprawling airport, the machinery was still running, the trains were still moving, and the vault beneath Gate C was still waiting. She thought about the voice on the phone, her father's voice telling her that what she'd found was enough. Maybe he was right. Maybe knowing the truth was enough, even if she couldn't prove it or share it with the world. But as she drove through the gathering dusk, she couldn't shake the feeling that the storm Dr. Creel had warned about was still coming. And when it arrived, she would need to be far from Denver and ready to keep moving. The vault beneath Gate C had shown her a glimpse of what lay hidden beneath the surface of the normal world. Now she would spend the rest of her life wondering when that hidden world would finally reveal itself, and what would happen to everyone who hadn't been warned to keep moving when the first storm began. Behind her, the lights of Denver disappeared into the distance, but she knew they would never really leave her. Some secrets, once discovered, became part of you forever. And somewhere in the darkness behind those lights, the machinery hummed on, waiting for the signal to begin whatever it had been built to do.